question time in the United States Senate. The senators acting as jurors in the impeachment trial of President Trump began interrogating the lawyers on both sides today. Amna Nawaz begins our coverage.
After days of carefully scripted arguments,
President Trump has abused the power of his office and must be removed from that office.
You're being asked to remove a duly elected president of the United States. That's what the articles of impeachment call for: removal.
Day 8 of the impeachment trial of President Donald Trump moved proceedings into a less predictable stage. House managers and Mr. Trump's legal team today began to field questions, up to 16 hours worth over 2 days, from those 100 senators who've so far sat quietly and listened.
I send a question to the desk.
Senators submitted written questions read aloud by Chief Justice John Roberts, alternating between Republicans and Democrats. Looming large over today's session, the battle over trial witnesses, including former National Security Advisor John Bolton, who reportedly confirms in his upcoming book that President Trump did link U.S. aid to Ukraine to an investigation into a possible political rival, former Vice President Joe Biden and his son Hunter. Bolton has said he would testify if subpoenaed. The very first question, jointly submitted by Republican Senators Collins, Murkowski, and Romney, sought guidance for senators weighing their votes.
If President Trump had more than one motive for his alleged conduct, how should the Senate consider more than one motive in its assessment of Article 1?
Counsel for the president, Patrick Philbin.
Once you get into a mixed motive situation, if there's both some personal motive but also a legitimate public interest motive, it can't possibly be an offense.
Other questions, like this one from Democrat Ed Markey, sought to clarify the record.
So that the record is accurate, did House impeachment investigators ask Mr. Bolton to testify?
Lead House Manager Adam Schiff.
The answer is yes. Of course, we asked John Bolton to testify in the House, and he refused.
Like much of the trial, today's session unfolded largely along partisan lines. Republicans asked questions of the president's legal team, and Democrats asked questions of the Democratic House managers. Republican Senator Ted Cruz inquired about quid pro quo.
As a matter of law, does it matter if there was a quid pro quo?
If a president does something which he believes will help him get elected in the public interest, that cannot be the kind of quid pro quo that results in impeachment.
Democratic Senator Chuck Schumer returned to the issue of witnesses.
Is there any way for the Senate to render a fully informed verdict in this case without hearing the testimony of Bolton, Mulvaney, and the other key eyewitnesses?
The short answer to that question is no. There's no way to have a fair trial without witnesses.
But as Democrats continue to lobby for the minimum 4 Republican votes they'd need to call witnesses, the president at a White House ceremony did some lobbying of his own.
And I want to just, if I could, mention senators, and maybe I'm being just nice to them because I want their vote. Does that make sense?
Down Pennsylvania Avenue, meanwhile, hundreds gathered at the Capitol to protest the president and ask the Senate to allow more evidence.
If trials mean there's no witnesses, if trials mean that there is no evidence, then we are all in extreme trouble.
Recent polls reflect a similar sentiment across the country. In a Quinnipiac poll this week, 75% of those polled say witnesses should testify in Mr. Trump's impeachment trial. That includes 49% of Republicans, 95% of Democrats, and 75% of independents. Inside the Capitol, more pressure, but in a more appetizing form. A local bakery delivering cakes to senators with messages like, "This is history in the baking. Let Bolton testify." Before that is decided, senators will continue their question and answer period tomorrow. For the PBS NewsHour, I'm Amna Nawaz.
And our Lisa Desjardins and Yamiche Alcindor are at the Capitol today, and both of them join me now. So Yamiche, to you first. As we know, this is the first day of questions. What are we learning from the kinds of questions that these senators were posing? Is it adding up to something that we have a better understanding of this case?
After watching several hours of senators' questions, what we know is that senators are really sending questions to their party's side. So if you're a Democrat, most of your questions were to the House managers. If you're a Republican, most of the questions were to the White House's team. And what they've been asking are really questions that allow them to rebut and also repeat a lot of their opening statements. On the Republican side, we saw questions like, well, why was Hunter Biden being paid by Burisma? We also saw questions that were like, why should the president have to turn over this? And is there anything wrong with the president having a relationship and having foreign policy included in this, in the aid? So that's on the Republican side. On the Democratic side, we saw questions that were like, they were more like, please repeat some of the falsehoods that the president's lawyers have been talking about. So what Democrats and Republicans were trying to do was really have both sides make the argument that this is why the president should or should not be removed. Lisa, of course, has been keeping a spreadsheet, so she'll probably get more into detail about what exact questions, but this was really a lot of senators repeating the points that we heard early on.
So, Lisa, what about that? You told us earlier you were keeping a spreadsheet. Give us some more detail. What kinds of questions were they asking? What does that tell us?
This is the work of myself and producer Jeffrey Guerre as we all go rotating in and out of the chamber and tracking all of this. Judy, let's just look at the first 3 hours of the questions today. In that time, senators asked 38 questions. Those questions had one sort of largest category, that was witnesses and evidence, which of course is the biggest topic in the news and the biggest decision senators have to make soon. But there was another very large category, that was motives. There was 13 questions about motives, but it was split. 7 of those questions were about President Trump's motives, 6 of those questions about Democrats' motives. So, Judy, as part of this, we're seeing both sides question each other's intent and whether they're sincere, whether the president himself had corrupt motives or not, and whether Democrats have proper motives. Now, another thing about questions, Judy, that I want to raise, I have a good source who told me that, in fact, the president's House advisors, that's Mark Meadows, Jim Jordan, the group who sort of led the efforts in the House for him, have been consulting with Republican senators in groups on what these questions should be. They have been strategizing and trying to form kind of a litigation strategy, if you will. Now, separately, I spoke to Mark Meadows and I asked him, do you think senators have enough questions for 2 days of this? And he said, yes, I do.
Interesting. So, Lisa, give us a sense, you mentioned witnesses. Where are we with this witness decision, the decision on whether they're going to be called, whether they're going to be documents?
There are just a few undecided Republican senators, and they will determine whether witnesses are called or not. And tonight, we want to look especially at 2 of those senators that you see, Senator Rob Portman of Ohio, and then also Senator Lamar Alexander of Tennessee. They have not announced a position yet, and behind closed doors, they are seen as senators who could go either way. Now, on the other hand, we can also report that it seems some other senators are making decisions in the president's favor. That includes Senator Pat Toomey of Pennsylvania, who was undecided, we understand, yesterday, and today has told myself and others that he's skeptical about the need to call witnesses. Judy, this just comes down to we think there are 2 to 3 votes already of the 4 needed to call witnesses. And that's why these 2 senators, Portman and Alexander, are so critical. If either one of them was a yes, that could change whether witnesses happen or not.
And that brings me back to you, Yamiche, because so much discussion about whether John Bolton, the former national security advisor, could be called as a witness. Even Lev Parnas, the associate of Rudy Giuliani. How is the White House pushing back on that?
There have been so many developments around John Bolton and whether or not he's going to testify today. What we learned today is that the White House on January 23rd, 5 days before the New York Times reported that John Bolton said in his manuscript that the president directly tied that aid to Ukraine to investigation to Democrats. 5 days earlier, the White House sent a letter to John Bolton that said this, and I want to put it up for some of our viewers. The manuscript appears to contain significant amount of classified information, including top secret level. It went on to say the manuscript may not be published or otherwise disclosed without deletion of this classified information. And tonight, John Bolton's lawyer put out a statement saying that he also responded to that. He said that he wrote back to the White House saying they do not believe there's any classified information in this manuscript. He's also making the point that he hasn't gotten a response back. And I should say really quickly, this is not the only witness going around. Lev Parnas was an associate of Rudy Giuliani. He was walking around the Capitol today saying that he wants to be able to testify. So he physically came here. He couldn't get in because he's on a GPS monitoring system because he's been indicted on federal charges. But what he told me is that President Trump knew about all of this, and he also said that he has multiple recordings of the president. So apart from John Bolton, there's also this witness that was literally walking around the Capitol today. So there are a lot of developments tonight, Judy.
Certainly are. Yamiche Alcindor, Lisa Desjardins, we thank you both.
You're welcome.